So, welcome to what is now the fifth CReMic Sir Richard Stone annual lecture, which is going to be delivered by Professor Debraj Ray, and as you can see, it's entitled Ethnicity and Conflict. For those of you who haven't been here before, these particular lectures were inaugurated to honour the contributions of Sir Richard Stone to the University of Cambridge, not least because of his directorship of the Department of Applied Economics in what I believe was its most productive phase. It's 45 to 55, its initial phase indeed, but also his contributions more generally to economics. Those of you familiar with Richard Stone's research will know that he afforded a central role to economic theory in the construction of empirical economic models, indeed a necessity to have a theoretical understanding of decision-making by economic agents, and of course the Stone Geary utility function is a kind of landmark of that particular approach. So, Debraj, of course, is very well known for his theoretical contributions, but a substantial part of his research, if you look through his CV, is very much being concerned with particular practical and policy problems. Let me say, first of all, a few words about the organisation of this lecture. So after I finish my brief remarks, I'll talk, which will be concerned with embarrassing Debraj in terms of his career and contribution to economics. Debraj will then present the lecture, which will last for approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. Then there'll be a short Q&A session in which you'll have the opportunity to obviously ask questions and make comments to Debraj about the material or contents of his lecture, and then we'll abandon to next door where refreshment will be concerned, where you be able to engage Debraj more directly in conversation and discussion. So Debraj is the Julius Silver, oops, betraying my classical education, I'm afraid. Julius Silver Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Science and Professor of Economics at New York University. He's widely recognised, as I said, as a leading international scholar in a number of areas of economics, which include microeconomic theory, development economics, and, of course, game theory. He is a Fellow of the Econometric Society, a 97 to 98 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a recipient of the Mahalanobis Memorial Medal of the Indian Econometric Society, and an 88 medal winner of the Indian National Science Academy for Outstanding Young Scientists in Mathematics. He's currently a co-editor of the American Economic Review and has filled numerous other senior editorial roles. He's been a co-editor of Theoretical Economics, the new Econometric Society journal for economic theory, and as a foreign editor of the Review of Economic Studies. I'm sure there are more, but these I would have thought were enough. He's currently serving on the editorial boards of the AEJ Microeconomics, American Economic Association Journal, Journal of Development Economics, and the Journal of Economic Growth too. And of course, Debraj has published in all of the leading international economic journals, Econometrica, American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and also the Review of Economic Studies. So I think that's time for me to stop, and it's my great pleasure, therefore, to let Debraj present the 2012-13 CReMic Sir Richard Stone Annual Lecture. Thank you, Debraj.
Thank you. Can you hear me up there? Is it okay? Should I stay rooted to this spot, or should I? Well, we'll see what happens if I move around. Okay, so I don't have as good a photograph of Sir Richard Stone as the one that was up there. I like the cigarette holder. But the Nobel citation for Richard Stone reads, for having made fundamental contributions to the development of systems and national accounts, and hence greatly improved the basis for empirical economic analysis. Not sure about the grammar of that citation, but anyway, but by my talk, I hope by emphasizing the conceptual foundations of empirical research will also represent a small step in this philosophical direction. And I'm very, very honored and very flattered to be here delivering this lecture. Actually, the last Partha Dasgupta just wrote to me saying he couldn't be here, but he remembered that I visited Cambridge last to work with him 28 years ago. So it's wonderful to be back, and of course to see Cambridge completely unchanged. But you know, 28 is just a drop in the bucket. So I want to talk today about ethnic conflict. And I want to start with telling you a little bit about the ubiquity of ethnic conflict, especially in developing countries. So, you know, it's an interesting fact that, internal social conflicts dominate interstate conflicts. Since World War II, there have been 22 interstate conflicts. 9 of them killed more than 1,000 people, battle deaths of the order of 3 to 8 million. And during the same period, there were 240 civil conflicts. Half of which killed more than 1,000, battle deaths of the order of 5 to 10 million, the mass assassination of up to 25 million civilians, and this does not count indirect deaths from displacement and disease, which is of the order of 4 times the violent deaths. And so by 2010, about 40 million people had been displaced, you know, apart from people killed. So there's a lot. What I want you to take away from this slide is that internal social conflict is extremely important, especially relative to interstate conflict. Here's a little graph. The gray stuff in this graph tells you about the frequency of internal conflicts versus the dark blue ones are the ones that started inwardly and then got internationalized. The light gray at the bottom are the interstate conflicts. And then you see at the very bottom, the light blue ones are the colonial conflicts that are kind of dying out by the end of the 60s and the early 70s. The second fact about internal conflict is that the majority of them appear to be ethnic in nature. Now, I mean this in the broad sense. I include religion in the description of ethnic. Okay, so I guess a good reference for this is the Doyle-Sambanis task force paper, which sort of makes this point. But also Jim Fearon, who's a leader in this area, has pointed out, you know, out of 700 known ethnic groups, over 100 of them have actually participated in some form of ethnic violence, which is a very large number. Yeah? And here are 2 interesting quotations taken from political scientists, and if there are students here, I want to get them excited about this. Okay, one is sort of Rogers Brubaker and David Layton talk about the eclipse of the left-to-right ideological axis, right? And this is sort of followed up by a very similar quotation by Horowitz. It's a monumental book by Horowitz on ethnic violence. He writes, in much of Asia and Africa, it's only modest hyperbole to assert that the Marxian prophecy has had an ethnic fulfillment. Okay? Now that's very interesting. If you think about this in, you know, sort of diagrammatically, it's like there's a box, that's society, and there's economic inequality, which is widespread, chronic in developing countries, right? One would expect that the salient outcome here would be to draw a horizontal line across that box, and people at the bottom would be fighting with people at the top, right? So that would be the Marxian salience, right? Instead, the lines usually are drawn vertically, if you like, okay? In other words, the boxes are divided from left to right instead of from top to bottom, and they're rich and poor in both groups that seem to be fighting against each other. That, I think, is fascinating. But why is it that when we have these big economic differences, why is that the salience comes in the other direction? I won't have much to say about this here. I've actually written about it, but I want to at least put that question up in your mind. So, but for the moment, let's get rid of the economics. Well, not entirely, but let's get rid of at least economic inequality as a driver of conflict. And I guess most of you know about this wonderful book by Amartya Sen called On Economic Inequality. And it starts, well, maybe the first paragraph has this sentence: the relation between inequality and rebellion is indeed a close one, and it runs both ways. Okay? One of the very few inaccurate statements by Amartya, okay? If you do look at early studies, actually, to be fair to him, if you look at studies which sort of early on which emphasize the distribution of income or land, then you see a relationship between inequality and violence. But by the time we get to the end of the 80s, okay, so if you look at the survey by Lickbach, he mentions 43 papers, and this is a great quote, some of them best forgotten, right? And says that the evidence on this stuff is thoroughly mixed. And this is a good summary by Midlarsky. It's a fairly typical finding of a weak, barely significant relationship between inequality and political violence. Rarely is there a robust relationship between the two variables. And we didn't quite believe this, so we decided, well, you know, Oindrila Dubé, Joan Esteban, Laura Mayoral, and me have been engaged in some work here where we thought on the way, let's just check this out. This is not a very serious exercise. But what we did, these headings there, Prio 25, Prio 1000, Prio Int, are characters that we'll meet again, so I might as well introduce you to them. So Prio stands for the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Okay? And they have a wonderful database which tracks different kinds of ethnic violence. Okay? So Prio 25 is a classification of a conflict that killed at least 25 people in a year. Likewise, Prio 1000 is something that killed at least 1,000 people in a year. That's basically civil war, right? And then there's other Prio categories, and Prio Int is like a weighted average of these categories. So these are different measures of violence. And this is a panel, a country panel where you're looking at, let's say, the Gini, okay, so Gini index of inequality, and as you see that there's, you know, if there's a relationship, it's negative, okay? More unequal countries appear in the cross-section, or at least, actually this is a fixed effects panel, tend to have less violence. But I wouldn't make much of the relationship first. It's small, okay? Let's agree to say that it's practically non-existent, okay? And as I was saying, you know, this is, I think, one of the great questions of political economy. Why doesn't class matter that much, right, in these situations? And I think it's one of the great questions, along with a whole host of other questions. For example, why don't developing countries, you know, endogenously throw up political parties that are genuinely progressive, redistributive? It's crying out for redistribution, okay? Why don't we see such parties coming to the forefront or winning the hearts and minds of people, okay? We don't see it, right? Along with similar questions in non-conflict settings, such as why economic inequality doesn't go hand in hand with progressive policies, is the great question of why economic inequality does not create the Marxian reaction. Okay, so that I think is an interesting question. Now, as I said, I won't have much to say about this, but let me put up a couple of pointers just to set the context, and then I'll move on. Why ethnicity might matter. Okay, so now if you think about the classical Marxian notion of conflict, you know, it's a conflict between the haves and the have-nots. If you think of most societies where we talk about workers taking over the means of production, well, you know, typically workers don't take over the means of production. What happens is that in a conflict that has been won, let's say, by the workers, there are now fiscal policies set in place, land reform. Well, land reform may be an example where the means of production are taken over, but in general, the redistribution that occurs from capitalists to workers is of a rather indirect nature, okay? In contrast, when we are all working in the textile sector, and some of us are, let's say, are immigrants or somehow different, okay, then the grab that we can perpetrate on those people is direct and immediate. Okay? By saying that remove some of these people as being somehow invalid workers, people who should not be in this sector, we can make an immediate gain. So in some sense, the idea that economically similar individuals or people engaged in the same occupational class, the same activity, are more likely to engage in conflict is not a crazy idea. We're just too attuned to Marx, but this is not there's nothing crazy about this idea that similar people are more likely to engage in conflict. Well, how are they going to engage in conflict? They can't just randomly lash out at one another, okay? That would be too unorganized a way of doing it. So ethnicity might be seen as a way of creating salience, okay? This is us, and that's them, okay? And therefore ethnicity may be a marker, okay, for such conflicts. The second point that, again, I want some of the students to think about here is that, you know, organized conflict needs both money and bodies. Okay? Now when you think about, the poor rising up against the rich, there's lots of bodies, not that much money. The rich, lots of money, but not that much bodies, assuming that they can't hire mercenaries. Sometimes they can, okay? But what's interesting about ethnic violence is that this peculiar perverse synergy of money and bodies can be given full play. Okay? So the rich among the ethnic group can finance a conflict, the poor can provide the labor, and this production function now has a great time, right, in generating conflict resources. So in some sense, ethnic conflicts can be powerful that way, right? And finally, the idea that ethnic identity, and this is more an economic history kind of question, that ethnic identity might become salient in an us versus them equilibrium. Us versus them can be written in a variety of ways, okay? But you can think of there being multiple claims to the surplus of a society. Class claims, geographical claims, agriculture versus industry claims, ethnic claims, okay? And you might imagine, because of a colonial heritage, governments might be sensitive to some of these claims. For example, post-colonial governments are very sensitive to class concerns. There are progressive income taxes, maybe not very progressive, but there are taxes in place. So in some sense, when a government is sensitive to a particular line of potential conflict, something else orthogonal jumps up and takes its place. Because that's where the differences haven't been properly smoothed out. Okay? So these are three reasons why ethnicity might actually matter. And there's I want to advertise a paper of Joan Esteban and mine on ethnic salience, which talks about some of these issues, but I won't do that here. In any case, all of this leads to a very different view of social conflict, right? It could well be economic. So the word economic doesn't necessarily have to do with economic divisions, right? The impetus for that conflict could well be economic, right? But it could be expressed via non-economic markers, such as ethnicity, right? And so in some sense this is compatible, but broader than what has come to be known as the primordialist view, right, which is due to people like Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis. The Huntington-Lewis view, for the few of you who may not know about this, is basically that they're irreducible differences between cultures, let's say Islamic and non-Islamic cultures. That's why we fight. They're primordial hatreds, right? Whereas this is more like an instrumentalist view, that we use ethnicity or religion as markers in order to extract economic surplus. So that's sort of more palatable to us economists, both from a philosophical point of view, if nothing else, right? And anyway, who wants to write a theory based on the assumption that people hate each other and theorem there is conflict, right? It would be boring. Plus, I don't think it's true. So, okay. So in this talk, and now we are going to glide a little closer to Sir Richard Stone's philosophy here. So the question is, what I want to ask is, do ethnic divisions affect conflict? So we've already seen that we'd be hard-pressed to get economics directly into the picture, okay? But what about ethnicity? I've been asserting all this while, and so have the anthropologists and the political scientists who have been writing numerous ethnographic case studies that ethnicity does matter. Well, let's see, from an economic, does it really matter if we subject that to some serious testing? First question, what's a division? Okay, well, luckily, the Soviet Union had this wonderful Atlas Narodov Mira in which they proposed an interesting measure of ethnic divisions. And this has come to be known as the fractionalization index, right? And it's up there for you. It's a very simple object. So Ni is the population share in group I, and there's a bunch of groups, okay? And imagine picking two people out of the hat of this society and asking, what is the probability that they belong to two different groups, okay? Well, that's the answer. Because if I think of Ni as just the probability with which we are drawing a person from group I, then Ni times 1 minus Ni is the probability that we'll be belonging, the two people will belong to two different groups, and then we of course have to add them up over all conceivable groups. Okay? So it's a measure of ethnic diversity in the society. Okay? And it's been used widely, and in fact, it does have a fairly good explanatory coefficient for stuff like growth, public goods provision, Alberto Alesina, Bill Easterly, there'll be several people who have worked in Ileana La Ferrara. It works well for explaining some of this stuff, right? But it doesn't work at all for conflict. Okay? And in fact, here's a summary from Jim Furen and David Layton, who say that the empirical pattern is thus inconsistent, I highlight the phrase thus inconsistent, with the common expectation that ethnic diversity is a major and direct cause of civil violence. Why do I highlight thus inconsistent? Because I don't think there's any reason to put the word thus down, right? What we've done is we've taken a measure of ethnic diversity off the shelf, as it were, something prepackaged, and if that measure doesn't show any relationship, well, it's not time to, the jury is still out on that question, right? So therefore, I think thus inconsistent is a little premature. Okay, but anyway, that's where, by the way, apart from this measure, has gone in, along with it, the kitchen sink, right? So basically, this literature is unfortunately, there's a lot of mining going on there, right? So at last count, somebody counted 85 explanatory variables that have been put into the right-hand side of regressions over here. So it's a classic case of measurement without theory, okay? Okay, so what I want to talk about here today is actually a theory that, that informs... Richard, what time did we start?
I think we were about 10 past, something like that.
Okay, 10 past? Okay, very good. So I want to talk actually about a theory that will inform an empirical specification. And then we're going to take that empirical specification forwards, not going to do it backwards, forwards, and then go to the data, okay, and see what it gives us. And you might say, well, it's all very easy for you to say now that you've written this down that you're going forwards, but I'll try to give you some indirect proof for that, okay, in a little bit. So this is again, a lot of this is based on work with my good friend Joan Esteban, who's in Barcelona. Okay, so here's a simple model of conflict. So let's think of M groups engaged in conflict. That's the population in group I. They add up to the total population, and I want to think of two kinds of prizes that are at stake in this conflict, both of which have been discussed at length in the literature. Okay. The first prize, let's think of it as a public prize, and I want to think of pi as kind of the per capita scale of that prize, and that's going to multiply this matrix, which I'm going to call Uij, and this matrix is a notion of distance across different groups. So what's Uij? Uij is going to be the utility that an individual from group I is going to get if group J's favorite public good is implemented, okay? So think of it as setting up a school on a line, right? And so the middle class's Uij will be pretty healthy. It doesn't matter whether people to the left or people on the right are putting in the school because this group is located in the middle, okay? So the Uijs will fall away, but not too much. But if you think of somebody on one side and the school is just located on the other side, then the Uij for that group will be very low, where I is this group and J is the other extreme. Okay, so this is a way of capturing a pseudo metric on it's not really a metric, but it's like a notion of distance across groups, right? So I've given some example. It could be religious dominance, political control, maybe primordial hatreds of different kinds, right? Or public goods, as we were just talking about. Then the other kind of prize that we talk about, and again here there's going to be a per capita value to it, mu, okay, and so if this is going to be a private prize, okay, so this is stuff that if I get, you don't get. That doesn't happen with a school, right, or a public good. If I get it, you get some decade, there's a Uij bit, right? With private prize, either I get the money or you get the money, okay, and so if you look at the total value of that prize, by definition, it's mu times n. I divide it by the share. This is going to get eroded. This is excludable. It's not a public good, okay? So this gets divided by the number of people in group I, and therefore its value is mu divided by little ni, where ni is the share of group I, okay? there's nothing dividing a public good. If we now institute a Hindu Rashtra in India, then the fundamentalist Hindus are all going to get their 1 unit of utility. Okay? It's not going to get divided up just because there are however 100 million of them. Right? Whereas with a private prize, if you grab oil revenues, well, then it will depend on the size of the people who are the group that's doing the grabbing. Okay? So oil, diamonds, scarce land, and so forth. Okay, so those are the two prizes. I'm going to put them together in a minute, and you see how they appear very differently in the final outcome. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how this game is going to get played out. So I want to think of individuals contributing resources to conflict. Okay, they're going to make contributions. Typically think of this as direct participation or funds or whatever, and there's going to be a convex utility cost for this participation. Later, if I have time, I'll tell you about how to bring income into this picture, but at the moment this is in its purest, simplest form. Okay, there's a convex utility cost. And if I think of the total contributions by group I as capital RI, then capital R is the sum of all the contributions, all the participation in conflict. That's my measure of conflict. That's the amount of shouting and screaming and looting and violence that's going on in this abstract little society. Okay? So that's my measure of conflict. Actually, that divided by the population. Okay? So why are they doing all this shouting and screaming in this model? The reason they're doing this shouting and screaming is because it influences the probability that they will win this conflict. Okay, so I'm going to write the probability of success as the ratio. So the probability of success for group J is the ratio of resources put in by group J to the total amount of resources in this society. Okay? So as I said, R divided by N is going to be our measure of overall conflict per capita. That's the model. Okay? So just to summarize, as I said, if group I wins the conflict, there are two kinds of prizes to be had. If you think it's conflict only about one kind of prize, then set the corresponding pi or mu equal to 0. Okay? But there's two kinds of prizes to be had. One is the public prize. I get to institute my favorite public good. I get UII. And then I get the private good. The private good gets eroded depending on the number of people in the population. Okay? So this is in case I wins the conflict. And if I does not win and some other group J wins, then no private good for you, okay? The private good's gone, that's just 0, 1, right? But you might get an echo, right, from the other person's public good. So the other person gets to institute, the other group gets to institute its favorite public good, and then you get this famous UIJ that I was talking about, and those are your payoffs, right? And therefore, the net expected payoff to any particular individual K in group I, you are going to ignore this algebra, you're going to switch off as I would if I were in the audience. But just to give you an idea, there is some expected public prize, okay? And that's just the probability that group J wins multiplied by the public payoff. And then there is a private prize. Note that there's no summation here because either I win it or I don't, okay? And then there's the cost of putting in the resources. So that's the net payoff from engaging in conflict. Okay, I'm almost there with my. By the way, guys, if you have a question, you're welcome to ask. I mean, we can treat this. I don't know what the norms and conventions of these things are, but you're welcome to ask me. Okay. Yeah.
Are you going to do like a joint model?
Yes.
Where you model these communities as individuals with those preferences?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're acting like a single unit.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm coming. Hang on, I'm almost done with the. Yeah, go on. I shouldn't have allowed this. Now that I have, go for it.
Isn't it the case that many conflicts start out not being ethnic but become ethnic later on? And so that's in some sense a device which is employed to perpetuate the initial motivations that are there, which may be non-ethnic completely.
That's exactly the point that's being made here as well. Yeah. But what I want to do is I want to use this model to work towards an empirically usable measure. Okay? So hang in there for a second. Let me.
Okay.
You're welcome to come back if this doesn't work for you. Hang on. To finish off the description of the model, we have to go back to the question that the gentleman there at the back raised, which is exactly what is the payoff to an individual, right? So here is one extreme. This is something that Mansur Olson would like to emphasize, okay, which is that individuals maximize their own payoff. So there may be a free rider problem, a very familiar free rider problem when it comes to public action. Okay? Another extreme is that individuals act as if to maximize group payoffs. Okay? They internalize the fortunes of the group. And I write as if because this may happen either out of altruism or out of coercion or out of some sense of, duty or whatever. Okay? So more generally, I'm going to take a leaf out of, now a positive leaf this time, out of Amartya's, what I consider to be Sen's best article, by the way, Sen Review of Economic Studies, 1964, okay, way ahead of its time, actually. So where he talks about individual K's extended utility, and extended utility has a selfish component, so this Greek letter here is the payoff to individual K in group I. And that's with some sort of weight, 1 minus alpha. But with weight alpha, she places emphasis on the payoffs of her compatriots in that group. Okay? So alpha, in a sense, is like a measure of intra-group concern or altruism, if you want to take that point of view, or it could be the extent of group cohesion, however defined in some reduced form fashion. There may be some coercion or persuasion involved there, okay? But it's the reduced form of something like that. Yeah? So now we are really done with a description of this model, and now I can say, going back to your question, is that with this extended utility in mind, each individual unilaterally maximizes her extended utility, okay? Which may involve altruism or it may not, right? Net of her costs. And what do I mean by this is written sloppily? What I mean is that this is a Nash, we look at a Nash equilibrium of this game played over all of society. This is a completely useless result for purposes of this lecture, but all I wanted to say is that an equilibrium of this game exists, and in fact, if the cost function is convex enough, there's a unique equilibrium of this game. Okay, so don't worry too much about it. So just to summarize, here are the key parameters and the key variables. Okay, so there's these notions of distances across groups. What's a distance? Well, I've generated these distances by looking at the utility from my favorite outcome minus the utility that I would get if group J were to implement its favorite outcome. So that's implicitly a notion of distance between group I and group J. Okay? Then there's the notion of how public the prize is. You remember pi was the scale of the public good and mu the scale of the private good. It turns out that all we need to know is, after controlling for per capita income, is to actually track their ratio. So this is the relative publicness of the prize. That's another important variable to keep in mind. The third item is group cohesion, which is this extended utility parameter alpha. The fourth are demographics. What are the population weights of each group? And finally, there's behavior, stuff that we won't observe, okay, which comes through contributions made, and then equivalently how that translates into the probabilities of success. Okay, so that's a kind of summary of what this model is all about. Okay? And as you might imagine, the probability of success is related to the population share, but it's not quite the same thing, right? Because of behavior. Yeah? But it turns out that for the theorem I'm going to talk about today, so the result that I'm going to take to the data, it is going to be actually convenient, and I'm going to show you that it's not a liberal use of this convenience, okay, to assume that the joint impact of deviations of pi from ni are negligible. I'm going to just assume that, and then I'm going to argue that that's actually a good assumption for the purpose of getting an explicit measure of the outcome. Okay? And so this is, now we're coming to the end of the theoretical section of this talk. This gives me a particular theorem, okay? This is the theorem that I do want to talk to you about, okay? And this is what I meant by theory driving the empirical analysis. It turns out that the word approximately here is that assumption I just made. It turns out that per capita conflict approximately solves the following equation. It turns out that there's only 3 measures of distribution that can enter into the determination of conflict according to this theory, okay? And they enter in this way. The first, let me introduce first to you the measures, and then I'll tell you how they enter. The first is a measure that Joan and I actually wrote in 1994 in a paper many years ago. I'll tell you a little bit about it in case you don't know it. It's a polarization measure. It's the squared polarization measure. What it does is it adds up the weight. It looks very, ignore the 2 over there. There is just a Gini coefficient. Okay, so it looks at the share of population I, share of population J, in group J, multiplied by the distance between groups I and J. And if you add that up, double sum over I and J, it's the Gini. But it's not the Gini because there's the square sitting there. And you might wonder, where did the square come from? I'll tell you about that later. But at the moment, there's a square sitting there, okay? So that's the first term. That's the first object that matters. The second is our friendly neighborhood fractionalization index that makes an appearance, okay? And finally, there is the true Gini index that also is involved. Okay, so notice it's exactly the same as the measure up there, but there's no square on it. And these 3 indices enter in the following way. To the extent that there is group cohesion, so alpha is positive, then conflict is driven by a weighted combination of polarization and fractionalization, where the weight on polarization is equal to the relative publicness of the prize, and the weight on fractionalization is equal to the relative privateness of the prize. Okay? The Gini coefficient does make an entry. I'm going to ignore it for the purpose of this talk, simply because, as you can see, it's divided by n. I'll give you an intuition for all of that, and it's going to vanish as the population goes to infinity. And as the population goes to infinity, the answer is that conflict, or actually the marginal cost of conflict, but ignore the left-hand side for the moment, is a weighted combination of polarization and fractionalization according to these weights. Okay? So that's the theorem. Now let's try to understand why this theorem makes sense. The first thing we do is to put alpha equal to 0, no cohesion. Then this says that for large populations there's no conflict. Check, that makes sense, right? Why? Because of the free rider problem. If you had no intra-group cohesion at all, then people would contribute less and less as the population went to infinity, and you'd run into the free rider problem. Okay? So you need some group cohesion for this thing to work for large populations. Okay. The second, why does polarization come in via the public prize, and why does fractionalization come in via the private prize? Okay? So let's think about that. Let's think of us being group I, right? Now, we're all contributing resources to the conflict. So that's approximately linear in Ni, right? Because we're all contributing, we multiply by Ni. Second, we care about each other. Okay? We care about each other to some extent, right? That's alpha times Ni. So our contributions are driven. So Ni of us are contributing. Each one cares linearly about Ni of us. That's how you get the Ni squared. Okay? That's how you get the Ni squared. So that's why the effective contribution of group I is being driven by the square of the population, but that is only if the prize does not degrade with population. If the price degrades with population, you have to divide by an Ni. When you divide by that Ni, the Ni squared, and one of those Ni's vanishes, and you get the fractionalization index. Okay? And that is why when the price is public, the polarization measure reigns supreme, and when the price is private, then the fractionalization measure reigns supreme. So just trying to give you some idea of why this thing works. Okay, let me leave it at that, and if you guys are interested, I can always come back and discuss it. Okay. Now, you guys have all seen the Gini index, and you've seen the You've seen the fractionalization index I just introduced you to. By the way, notice that the fractionalization index is also a Gini index, really. It's just the Gini index for when distances across groups are 0 or 1. You can, if you just open this out, you'll see that. Okay, so there's nothing new about fraction. It's all Gini in disguise. The only thing that isn't a Gini in disguise but looks a lot like it is the polarization measure. And about that I want to say a few words just to tell you where it comes from. Okay? So here's a very quick introduction to polarization the way we thought about it in 1994. Okay? Here's a distribution of income. So I want you to think of, many groups here, if you like, right? And the distances as their income distances. That's just as an example, okay? And the black line is the original distribution of income. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this particular little mode over here and squeeze it up so that people's incomes are redistributed so that I get the blue line over there. And similarly, I'm going to create another mode over there. Okay, so intuitively what's happening? This society was a sort of flatly distributed society, and now a notion of poor is building up on this side. Okay? And a notion of rich is building up on that side. That's what I'm trying to sort of graphically get at. Right? That's like the new density of this society. Something seems intuitive that if I were to tell you that the blue society is more conflictual than the black society, I mean, we could debate it, but it's not a crazy thing to say. The reason it's not a crazy thing to say is because there's a better notion of us versus them in the blue society compared to the black society. It's not a crazy, I mean, you certainly cannot say that, oh, this is impossible. The blue society has to be more peaceful than the black society. But I'm making a very weak statement. I would argue more strongly that it probably is more conflictual. But here's the interesting thing. If you take any measure of income inequality which is consistent with Lorentz domination or with second order stochastic dominance, all those inequality measures will fall when you move from the black to the blue. Every one of them will fall. Why is that? Because if you go back to Tony Atkinson's work, then you'll know that locally everywhere we've done Pigot-Dalton transfers. If Partha was here, Partha's worked on this as well. We've done Pigot-Dalton transfers which are equalizing. So every known inequality measure has to fall. So inequality not only, it does not allow us to even have this argument. It says, no, economic inequality has fallen, and yet intuition suggests that conflict could have gone up in this society. Okay? So inequality is just the wrong measure for thinking about this sort of spikiness. That's the point I'm trying to make over here. But the polarization measure that we introduced, and in fact we introduced it precisely to handle this, so this is not serendipity but intent on our part, the polarization measure actually will go up. Okay, when you confront these two distributions. Okay, so that's what polarization does. It's different from inequality. That square makes a big difference. Okay. Yes.
I think now going back to the earlier slides, I think you've been unfair to someone when someone suggested that that comment about thus diversity. I think diversity not leading to something but leading to something.
Yeah.
Now you're actually using inequality in the same way, in the sense that when you say inequality doesn't do this, you mean the measures that have been used for equality doesn't capture that.
No, every measure of inequality. Every measure of inequality that's consistent with the Lorentz curve comes down. Not the Gini. Every one of them. Because of second order stochastic dominance. I'm not making the same statement. Everything that's consistent with the Pigot-Dalton transfer principle will move in the wrong direction. Not just one of them. Not the Gini or the coefficient.
Those are the only ways of
so the Bible of economic inequality measurement is Dasgupta, Sen and Starrett, Atkinson, Sen, all of them agree with second order stochastic dominance. Hardy, Littlewood and Polya. A lot of Cambridge people in there. Okay. So here's the point. With the polarization measure, actually, if you just take a little example, if you look at equal shares of the population across all groups, just to give you a fix on this, right? The polarization measure actually is maximized at 2 groups and then steadily declines. The fractionalization measure keeps going up. Okay? So that's the way of how the polarization and the fractionalization measures are different. Okay? And since I am now in my mid-50s, I am allowed to quote from myself. Okay? So Joanne and I, when we wrote our paper, we wrote this in the paper. I want to quote from it because it sort of seems to work in this simple game theoretic model. We begin with the obvious question, why are we interested in polarization? It is our contention that the phenomenon of polarization is closely linked to the generation of tensions, to the possibilities of articulated rebellion and revolt, and to the existence of social unrest in general. And I think what this result brings out is that with conflict over public goods, that statement seems to be correct. With conflict over private goods, it's really fractionalization that has to do more with it. At least that's what the theory says. Okay? Very quickly, and then I'll go to the data. I want to tell you a little bit about the empirical findings. I cheated a little bit. I made a restriction that the joint impact of the deviation of the behavioral probability of success and just the statistical probability given by NI could be neglected. How good is that approximation? Well, there's some statements we can make, but for very restrictive situations. 2 groups with public prizes, all groups the same size and symmetric losses. These are exact. We get exact results. We also know that the approximation error goes to 0 for high conflict societies. But in general, there's no theorem. We didn't have a theorem. What we did was we numerically computed. So what we did was we took our model society and we used that model, so we generated different values of distances, cost functions, UIJs, and so forth, and we generated the true level of conflict. Sorry, I should have used the word true. True in the model, right? The true model predicted level of conflict. And then we compared that with the level of conflict predicted by this approximate model, right? So here are examples of these graphs. So this is for contests where there are just 0-1 distances across groups, but I'll show you a bunch without, okay? And up there is what I'm using in the model and what I just showed you in my theorem. The convex combination of polarization and fractionalization. Down here is the true, again, true in this model, the true level of conflict. And the 45-degree line would be exact. It's not on the 45-degree line, it's not exact. But you notice that there isn't, and these dots come from taking thousands of economies, right, with different parametric values, and then just computing both of these values. And notice that if there had been an analytical result, we could have proved there would have been a nice line somewhere here. There's no line, it's a scatter. And yet the scatter hugs the 45-degree line to an extent we find remarkable, and yet we can't prove anything about it. Okay? Such is life. If one of you guys can do it, that'll be great. But just to give you, but there's an interesting point here that I just want to make, and then I'll move on. Notice that, by the way, this diagram is drawn for, this is for a private good. Less private, lambda equals 0.2, getting to be public now, lambda equals 0.8, super public, lambda equal to 1, okay? And notice how the dots move from one side of the 45-degree line to the other side of the 45-degree line. Okay? Why is that? Mansur Olson, let me give you a reason for why, okay? Private goods conflict. What happens is that we end up understating the amount of conflict. My approximation understates the amount of conflict, lies to the right of the 45-degree line. The reason is small groups fight tooth and nail. In the true model, their PIs are bigger than their NIs. That's what Olson taught us. The small groups solve the free rider problem better. They are going to put in more effort relative to their population size. And as a result of that, the model that I use, the approximation I use, does not take Olson into account, and therefore it understates the amount of conflict. Okay, the tooth and nail aspect. When we get to public goods, Olson gets reversed. It's actually large groups that end up putting in more effort. So the situation with public goods conflict is that the true conflict, again the true in the model, the true conflict is not as much as it is because large groups are actually super dominant. So it's interesting that even in an approximation idea exercise like this, classical notions of free rider and the Olson small group problem are all hidden in here. Okay, I wish I had more time to talk about this, but I should move on. Here's another set of numerical results now with UIJs. Here's one with small populations so that the Gini coefficient is also used, and here's one with different cost curves. So you see, I don't know, it's pretty good, and yet we don't know how to really analytically get a handle on it. Okay, so here's the summary of the theory. I'm done now, right? Here are the predicted connections. The conflict over public goods should be related to polarization. Conflict over private goods should be related to fractionalization. The overall connection is that conflict per capita is related to a convex combination of public and private goods, okay? Polarization and fractionalization, with these, where lambda is the relative importance of the public price and alpha is a measure of within group cohesion. So that's the prediction. Now, this by itself maybe tells you a little bit about why fractionalization on its own is not generating action in the empirics. It's because a more fractionalized society is having two effects. One is the reason why people took it on board. It's a more diverse, perhaps more conflictual society, but we're losing the polarization. Okay? Because fractionalization and polarization may move in opposite directions. And this is saying if you control properly for polarization, if you want to, I don't think of polarization as a control, but if you want to just think of it for a minute as a control, then a fractionalized society would give you more conflict. At least that's what the theory is saying. Okay? And what we've done by just looking at fractionalization alone is that we bundle these two notions, P and F, which should be separate, we bundle them into one measure. Okay, and that's what we're trying to get at here. Okay. So let me talk then now about the empirical, whether we can take this in some interesting empirical way to the data. So this is joint work again with Joanne and now with Laura Mayoral. We have actually a survey of this in Science at the end of last year. If you're interested, you can take a look. Okay, so what we do is we look at 138 countries over 1960 to 2008, so this is sort of pooled cross-section. And here are different measures of conflict. This is our baseline, Prio 25. Remember, this is conflicts recorded by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, which have 25 plus battle deaths in a year. These are all intra-state conflicts, okay? Prio CW is Prio 25 and the total number of deaths exceeding 1,000. Prio 1000 is 1,000 per year, and Prio INT is a weighted combination of the above. And then we use another measure from Banks, which looks at assassinations, political strikes and riots and so forth. So there's a bunch of different left-hand side variables in this exercise. What about the right-hand side? Okay, well, first what do we have to do? We have to create these measures of polarization and fractionalization for each society, right? So first we have to define a notion of groups. Now we are in notoriously unstable terrain. Why are we on notoriously unstable terrain? Well, because part of the problem is that the very definition of a group is endogenous, right? So for example, the Hutu-Tutsi conflict, are Hutus and Tutsis two different groups? We don't really know. Right? I mean, did they have any serious ethnic salience before they were divided by by the colonial powers? We don't really know. So there are issues here of how one even defines groups. One might define in societies which are conflictual. One might define sharply these groups which are engaged in the conflict. Okay, so. For this, we have to turn to our guru in these matters, who's James Fearon. And Jim has this wonderful database, the Fearon database, where he's acutely aware of this problem, okay, of the fact that we might be conditioning our group construction on the realization of conflict. There's a detailed discussion of this, okay, and we use his notion without any change at all. Exactly Fearon's notion of culturally distinct groups in he has it for 160 countries, we take it for the 138 countries that we study. Essentially based on ethno-linguistic criteria. Now, if for the purists among us, and there are several, okay, I'm not one of them, but one might argue that this is not good enough, in which case we have to retreat to something even more exogenous. Now, there's a trade-off, okay? I'll tell you about the trade-off in a second. So the trade-off, so here the other one is this fascinating database called Ethnologue, right? So what Ethnologue contains information on 6,900 living languages, okay? And tells you about the group sizes of each of these languages, right? What's the relative proportion of people who speak these languages, okay? Now, there's no reason, now this is going to the other extreme. We are defining groups purely on the basis of language. The exogeneity problems presumably has been handled to the satisfaction of most of us, right? But on the other hand, we've been propelled into the other side of saying that, well, these groups may not really have much to do with conflict as we know it today. So there's a fine line that has to be walked here between relevance and identification, okay? So in any case, but we use both the Fearon and the Ethnologue database, okay? And now the next task is, how do we construct these UIJs, okay? What's a UIJ, right? Again, more heroic constructions here. So what we do is we decide to go with linguistic distances across groups. Okay? And the way we do linguistics, so we use linguistic distances on language trees. So, for example, so you can divide all the languages into world. You can get them coming down a tree depending on how they are bifurcating, right? So, for instance, all the Indo-European languages will lie in some common subtree. Okay? And because I have my Spanish and Catalan co-authors, let's say if once you get into Spanish and Basque, they diverge at the very first node, right? And then Spanish and Catalan share the first 7 nodes, even though you wouldn't think that given what's going on, okay? And then there's a maximum of 15 steps of branching like this, okay? And what you can do is you can define a similarity index. I don't want to get into the details of this, but there's details in the paper, more details than you'll ever like. We can define a notion of similarity across 2 languages as the ratio of the amount of common branches they share relative to the entire length of that tree. Okay? And using that, we can define a notion of distance across 2 groups. So, in short, the Fearon database of groups, and across them, a language distance. Now, notice something nice about language distances is that even if I retreated to the Ethnologue data set, these language distances would preserve me to some extent. Why? Because the Ethnologue data set would give me hundreds of groups, right? But the fact that there's a language distance means that the distances would smooth out these differences across groups, which is nice, right? Except that it wouldn't work at all for fractionalization. It would work very well for polarization, but for fractionalization with 0-1 distances, it's not going to work. Okay? But just to give you an idea of what we do here. Okay? And then there's the kitchen sink, except that we try to, we try to use exactly the controls that people who work in this literature also use, Paul Collier and David Layton and Jim Fearon and so forth. So we have a bunch of controls. Okay. Okay, so what we do is we want to estimate this equation. So this is exactly our conflict equation. So this is marginal cost of conflict on the left-hand side, and this should be related to polarization and fractionalization. So we're using the theory to impose restrictions on what it is that we do, and then there's a bunch of controls. Okay, so what we don't really observe this full stuff but we get the Prio data, so this implies that this original equation gets transformed into a latent variable model where once we cross a particular threshold, Prio will record it for us. So this is the equation that we estimate using maximum likelihood logit. We do all sorts of other, we do probit, OLS, and a whole bunch of things which I can show you if you're interested. Okay? So that's the project. A bit crazy, but worth trying, just to see where we can go with it, right? So here's what we get, and I want to try and hopefully convince you that we've tried out several different variations, and what you get is quite interesting. So the first column is just regressing. So this is baseline with Prio 25. We just regress Prio 25 on polarization, fractionalization, and population. And then we start adding in the controls, okay? Various things, GDP per capita, oil, mountainous terrain, non-contiguous territory, whether it's democratic, constraints on the executive, autocracy, political rights, civil liberties, and so forth. And all of this, by the way, we are carrying past conflict with a lag as an explanatory variable. The stuff in red is the standard set of controls in the literature. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight that for you. And you notice that there's a remarkable, a strong positive relationship exhibited both by polarization and by fractionalization, which you won't see if you take that P out of that equation and just put an F, because it's going to take these F and P joint effects, and as I showed you in that diagram, F and P are conceptually moving in opposite directions. Okay, so that's okay. So that's the baseline that I want you guys to take a look at. And just to give you an idea, okay, so this is of how this might work. You can write down the countries and all the deciles of fractionalization. What we did was we took countries in the 45th to 55th decile of fractionalization. They're these, the Dominican Republic going up to Guatemala. They belong to the middle of the fractionalization zone. And we arranged them in increasing order of polarization. Just to give you an idea that the data, just to eyeball the data to see that it makes sense, that sort of conflict tends to go up with polarization just inside this one decile, okay, the middle decile. And similarly here, we take countries in the 45th to 55th polarization decile and then rank them by fractionalization. And again, you see a broadly positive correlation between conflict and fractionalization. Okay, the coefficient is these are residual scatters, okay, for polarization and Prio 25, fractionalization and Prio 25, and the coefficients are not small. Okay, I mean, if you go from the 20th percentile of polarization to the 80th percentile of polarization, then the probability of a Prio 25 conflict doubles. Okay? And the same happens as you move from the 20th percentile of fractionalization to the 80th percentile of fractionalization. Okay. So I'm not going to bore you with all of this, but just to give you some idea, then what we do next is hit this with as many robustness checks, and I'm sure you guys can think of more, but we hit them with as many as we can think of, right? And it's fairly remarkable how this holds up, okay? So alternative definition of conflict, alternative definition of groups, the ethnologue, binary versus language-based conflict onset, region and time effects, and so forth. The one thing I want to show you, the one where fractionalization doesn't work very well, is the ethnologue one. So these are, by the way, these are different conflict measures, and you just eyeball them very quickly. Here's the one I wanted to show you. Here's ethnologue, right? And these are different types of conflict. Note how fractionalization now loses all power. Okay, that's because we are taking these linguistic groups, 0-1 distances. It's just not tying in, okay, as it shouldn't, as it can't, right? The polarization measure continues to work. The reason it continues to work is because it's mediated, as I was telling you, by this notion of distances across these groups. It kind of smooths it out. Okay, let me skip that, and okay, so let me come to the very last. Am I doing well for time? It's 5:10 now, so I'll be done in about
10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So now, so let me get even more. So we were kind of encouraged by this, and we thought, let's try to take it a step further and see what happens. Okay. So more heroism. So this is our basic equation. Remember, conflict per capita is related to polarization, fractionalization in that way. And of course, when we are putting all this stuff along the cross section, I mean, I'm not trying to say that this empirical exercise is devoid of problems. It has many of them. One of them that we didn't particularly like is that it makes the implicit assumption, that regression makes the implicit assumption that lambda and alpha are the same across all countries. Okay? Can we drop that? Can we try to drop? Well, this will require, as I said, more heroism. How are we going to try and drop it? Okay? So what we do is we try to construct measures of privateness and publicness and construct lambda for each country separately. Okay? So what we do is, for publicness, what we do is we look at the extent of control you get when you come to power. Okay? And that we take to be an average of autocracy from the Polity 4 measures, absence of political rights from Freedom House, absence of civil liberties from Freedom House, and in case you think that we take a simple average of these measures, but there's an appendix to our paper which contains a long discussion of the robustness of different ways of doing this. Okay? And for privateness, we use per capita oil reserves. Okay? So then we construct a lambda. This capital lambda is our proxy for the little lambda. Okay? Our capital lambda is the monetized value of publicness, so it's the control while you're in power times per capita GDP, divided by the sum of that and oil reserves per capita. So that's our lambda. We are throwing our hat into the ring with this lambda, right? And again, there are variations on this which are discussed in the paper. So if I take this empirical specification seriously, then what I should do now is, if I run a regression, I'll come to alpha in a second. If I run a regression now where I put in country-specific values of lambda obtained like this, okay, so it's essentially I'm running an interaction. Okay, I don't know whether to call it an interaction or this is just another variable. The empirical, the econometricians can educate me on that. Okay, but once I put that in, then P and F should lose their own separate explanatory power, and lambda times P and 1 minus lambda times F should come to the forefront. Okay, so this is the regression. So notice here, don't worry about the control. So this is the one where P and F are entered, but then P times lambda and F times 1 minus lambda. Okay? And notice that once we put this in, P and F lose significance. And P times lambda and F times 1 minus lambda become highly significant. Okay? Then what we did was emboldened even further, and now we are really at the limits of stuff that's conceptually acceptable, but I'll tell you anyway. Emboldened even further, we tried to get measures for group cohesion, and we did that by looking at the 2005 wave of the World Values Survey, looking at all the questions that they ask about what do you think of community, what do you think of whether you should help others, and so forth. They're taking a simple average of that to construct a measure of alpha. We then go with P and F in the regression, as well as P lambda alpha and F 1 minus lambda alpha, exactly as that equation is telling us to do. And once again, we get the significance of these terms while P and F are insignificant. Okay? Now, why am I putting this up? I know it's a stretch, but I still want to put it up. I want to expose this in front of you, and we can take it as it is. But one interesting thing that it suggests is that if conflict had been truly primordial, then when I made these controls for lambda and 1 minus lambda, P and F should continue to have mattered. If really people just get into conflict because they hate each other, because that was allowed for so far, it should have worked. Okay, we would have still gotten some reason for P and F being significant simply because of primordial hatreds. Well, it turns out in these equations that once you control for the publicness and the privateness of the good, the primordial terms appear to vanish. Take that as you will, okay? But I submit that this is indirect evidence, or at least suggestive of the fact, of the possibility that much of the conflict that we observe is indeed instrumental and not primordial, okay? There's one more thing I want to say about this equation, okay? Is that if any of you guys are running a conflict equation, this equation also tells us something about how to look at shocks. So for example, suppose we are interested in the effect of commodity price shocks on conflict, which is something like people like Tim Besley and Torsten Persson have been working on, okay? But suppose we wanted to do it in the context of this model. This equation tells you where that shock should be entered. If that shock is going to be a private resource, we first have to decide whether this is going to be a public goods shock or a private goods shock. Okay? Once we've decided on exactly what kind of shock it is, this equation says that if it's a private goods shock, you better interact that effect with fractionalization. And if it's a public goods shock, you should interact it with polarization. So it's disciplining the way in which you should do your empirical work when you're thinking about different kinds of shocks. Okay? And I think that's, you know, it's going out on a limb, but at least it's giving you something that potentially is useful. Okay. Let me summarize. Actually, in the I have another talk here, but I'm not going to give it to you. Okay, on Hindu-Muslim violence. But I thought if I were going too quickly, I'd do the other one. But I won't. Don't worry. Okay. So I'm going to summarize here. So I want to say exclusionary conflict is as important as redistributive conflict of the Marxian variety, maybe more. Okay, and often made salient by the use of ethnicity or religion. And the basic question we've asked is, do societies with ethnic divisions experience more conflict? We develop a theory of conflict that generates an empirical test. A convex combination of two distributional variables predicts conflict. The theory appears to find some strong support in the data. Okay? So I'm going to end here, but I just want to end by saying one thing is that this is work. You know, I thought long and hard about presenting work that I hate presenting finished work, but since I thought that this is a more formal lecture, let me at least, and most of you will not know about this work, let me at least take the advantage to take the opportunity to sell it to you and at least make you aware of it. Okay, but also I wanted to say is that we really view this as the first step in a longer term research program, and you notice that in this first step there's practically no economics in it. Okay, where is the economics? Where is the surplus that has to be grabbed? It's there, but in a very abstract form. There's several other things where the economics is very important. One is this cost function of putting in resources. Okay, remember the body is money problem. Have I tried to model that? Not at all, right? Is there an interesting way to model it? The answer is, I think, yes, okay? Which is to open up these groups and allow for there to be income inequality inside these groups and have people in these groups contributing either in terms of money or in terms of labor. Then have a production function that maps the money and the labor contributions, and that would be the R that I've been talking about in this paper over here, okay? That would give you additional predictions about whether within group inequality is conflictual or not. Okay? So that's stuff that Laura and Joanne and I are working on now. We are trying to extend this model to actually put in economics or considerations of economic cost and benefit into conflict. Okay? Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, so first question, please. Barry.
Early on, you mentioned you were surprised how little distributive conflict there is in less developed countries. You wondered why we don't see progressive redistributive movements. And emphasis was on exclusionary conflict. Strikes me that's just as big, maybe bigger puzzle in developed countries. There's tremendous inequality in the
Right.
U.S. Say, why don't we see some progressive redistributive movement? It could take a different form. It wouldn't be violent struggle. It would be something done politically or on Wall Street. And look at our political parties. They're not aligned along class lines. They seem to be in this vertical alignment, as you were talking about.
Right.
I wonder if you thought about developed countries and what this has to say about that.
Right. What's the matter with Kansas? In short, right? I mean, there's a great book on this. Yeah. So that's. I think these questions apply. I think just as urgently to developed countries. I have to say that given my own interest in violent conflict, I have not thought about those issues. But of course, I've read about them, and I'm completely aware of that parallel. I really don't have much more than that to say about that particular topic. But it's there, certainly. So I think it's a very valid point.
Research program strikes me some more papers today.
I think it's time we wrote less papers.
So I wanted to get a sense of what you meant by publicness. And as you said, you
Sure.
haven't modeled it. But there is work which says that as fractionalization goes up, your ability to maintain public goods changes.
Right.
So is fractionalization not affecting peace relationship with the cost of conflict?
Okay, so that's a good question, but let me take the opportunity to clarify something. There are two issues. One is the notion of fractionalization or polarization and the ability to make voluntary contributions to public goods. The other is the notion of polarization or fractionalization and how it affects your instinct to grab those goods. These are two different issues. Okay? So for example, Alberto Alesina and Eliana La Ferrara have worked on contributions to public goods, and generally, or Abhijit Banerjee and Rohini Somanathan, right? Where you see that there is a tendency to contribute less in fractionalized society. But that's creating those goods. And this is talking about grabbing those goods. Right? So these are two completely different issues. So it's perfectly compatible to say that fractionalized societies don't produce much public goods. That statement is completely compatible by saying polarized societies are the ones that fight more about public goods. These are two sides of the coin. One is grabbing, the other is creating. Dynamic setting, yes. So then there's.
So you haven't modeled the investment.
No. So then exactly. So then one is getting into deeper and murkier waters, which is that and interesting waters where there would be the sequential provision of these goods and then the grabbing of them. Right? That's something I haven't thought about. That sounds interesting. Yeah.
You talked about ethnicity as something that's visible and fixed, and then you mentioned a little bit about the indigeneity of groups when you talked about the empirics, but I was wondering how your model would be affected if instead of ethnicity you look at something often referred to as ethnic self-identification, so where individuals choose the groups that they belong to,
Right.
and they may belong to more than one group with different
Right.
emphasis.
So that's an excellent question. That's a classical question in coalition formation. So I've actually written two papers on that. One is in a working paper form, and the other is the one I referred to in the AER, the 2008 paper. So what it does is, so there are potential cleavages in that society. There's potentially cleavages along income lines and along ethnic lines. And then think of a bargaining model. People make proposals to, there are political entrepreneurs who make proposals, say, hey, let's join the working class, let's form a coalition of workers. Or they say, let's all Hindus band together and go after those Muslims, right? So in other words, there are proposals that are coming from political entrepreneurs, and what the 2008 paper shows that given these potential cleavages that are there, the equilibrium cleavage under some conditions which we identify is along the Hindu-Muslim lines rather than along rich-poor lines. So that's the coalition formation question. Here's another, let me give you another example. so again, from a game theoretic viewpoint, right? Think of a characteristic function game. Okay, so in a characteristic function game, every coalition has a value, and the grand coalition of the whole society has a value. So think of that value as the surplus available in that society, right? Now think of ethnic organization or spatial organization or gender or occupational organization, like agriculture versus industry, as all determining different coalition structures which are trying to grab that surplus. And the question that you're asking here is that, is the core of that game empty or not? Okay, so which coalition is actually going to be able to grab that surplus in equilibrium? Okay. Now we know that these games may well be super additive. Okay, they're super additive because conflict is costly. Because conflict is costly and inefficient, the grand coalition the game is super additive because by creating sub coalitions you're actually destroying surplus. Okay? But we know that super additivity is not enough for the core to be non-empty. You need stronger conditions than super additivity. Okay? So in these situations you'll get jockeying of, I'm answering your question, I realize in a somewhat abstract way, but what I'm saying is that in short you'll have jockeying of people who are trying to belong to different kinds of political coalitions in order to grab that surplus. Okay? So you can write down models of coalition formation. They're in a very nascent stage, okay? But you can write down these models to think about these questions. But the shadow potential divisions, namely Hindu and Muslim, somehow matter. Okay? The fact that I have an odd number of hairs on my head and you have an even number does not matter. These things have to be put down as assumptions in that model. And then the question is, which of these light switches is turned on in equilibrium? But you have to have a potential set of light switches. That, if you want to ask why are those potentials set there, then you're in infinite regress. Okay, you'll have to go on, ask you, well, why is that there, why is that? You can't generate all of this from nothing, at least I believe you can't. There has to be some potential salience. Okay.
So one of the things that you said was that you were working, on introducing more economic elements in your work.
Right.
So going back to the work you presented, one might wonder how much of the variance in conflict can be explained by the variables which are non-economic.
Right.
And so is there a sense in which a lot has been explained, sort of crudely the R square?
Right.
Or is there a lot, how good are the polarization or fractionalization indices, and how much more there is?
I think there's lots left. So I think there's lots. A lot left. So in the stuff that I was going. Okay. So very quick answer. I think we were having a chat about this, right? There's a lovely paper by, I recommend everybody read it, by Oindrila Dubé and Juan Vargas on Colombia, okay, where they show that oil booms actually increase conflict, whereas coffee booms decrease conflict, okay? And the point that they make is that oil booms create grabbable resources. Oil is very capital intensive, but coffee uses lots of labor. So when there's a coffee boom, wage rates go up. So people don't want to go into conflict. Okay? So two resource booms have the opposite effect, because one affects the opportunity cost of engaging in conflict and the other affects the resource grabbing incentive, right? So what I've done in this work that I wanted to talk a little bit about but didn't have the time is apply this to Hindu-Muslim violence. So you can think of Hindu incomes and Muslim incomes as either having the oil aspect, that they're grabbable, right? Or having the coffee aspect, that they affect the opportunity cost of engaging in violence, depending on whether these groups are more aggressors or victims. So imagine that a group is a victim group. Then it will be, their income growth will be more like oil, because that's stuff to be grabbed. Therefore, the income growth in a victim group should increase conflict. What about an aggressor group? They're more like coffee. If their income grows, they'll be less likely to engage in conflict. So income growth in an aggressor group is likely to decrease conflict. So you can use this as a way of teasing out whether conflict is actually being initiated by Hindu groups or Muslim groups. So this paper is about this, but I won't give you the answer to that question just now, but the point is to say that both of these effects are strong. These income changes have big effects on conflict. So to answer your question in the affirmative, there's lots left. And this is only one piece of the whole story. Right? Sorry, I was too long.
Yes, well, thank you for a very interesting lecture.
You're welcome.
Enjoyed it very much. I have a question which is probably an ignorant one, but I come from history, not from economics or social studies. What do you do in all of this with, can I say, the historic aspect? I can think of examples, I won't give them, of situations where you have people, let us say, two tribes. Originally they were fighting over very simple sets of resources, power, and so forth. Times have changed. They're now settled somewhere else. They have the same language, same ethnic group,
Right.
same religion, but the hostilities, if I can say historic hostilities, have continued to affect
Right.
all of their
Right.
interactions.
Right.
And of course, this in a modern political context
Right.
can make extremely difficult situations. And I wondered how you worked this into your...
Right. There's actually an interesting paper on cycles of distrust by Asimoglu and Volitsky, which talk about issues of, the chicken and egg of conflict. The chicken and egg is extremely important, right? And in fact, in this Hindu-Muslim story, much of the finger-pointing exercises that go on about who did the Muslims tear down this temple because the Hindus broke down that mosque, right? And it's all lost in infinite regress, right? Some of these statistical exercises that I was just describing can break through that chicken and egg. Not break through in the sense of negating it, but to say that there are also still political entrepreneurs taking advantage of the situation today, okay? And that's what I just described. But then there's also the chicken and egg part of the story, which is also as important. And the way it shows up here is that in all the regressions, we have lagged conflict as an explanatory variable, and there's huge serial correlation. So in other words, a society that was conflictual in the past is likely to be conflictual today. Okay, so it's there in these regressions, but it's not our main interest for the purpose of this talk or the purpose of the paper that we've written. But somebody could easily go into that world. In other words, that control variable could be brought to the forefront and be treated as a variable in its own interest. So in short, the answer to your question is that there is a huge historical component to all of these conflicts. But that doesn't mean that these ethnic variables and income variables don't play an additional role today. It's all together, it's all mixed up. Just like, so ethnicity is one, economics is another, history is a third.
Also because, using my tribal example, you will very often, I can think of several examples
Yes.
where one side opts for, let us say, left wing, automatically the other tribe will opt for
As a
right
reaction.
wing, because these are their historic positions,
Right.
and they've simply translated it into a modern...
Right.
Thank you for your...
No, that's a good point, I agree, yeah, okay. Thank you.
One more question.
Sorry.
I was just wondering, so as a fairly naive observer of the news, something that seems important in conflict is contagion. Such
Right.
as in the Arab Spring, conflict grew out of conflict.
Right.
There's a sense of contagion. Is that something that you feel can be built into your model? Perhaps through the cost function, like you mentioned, perhaps increasing returns to resource
Right.
allocation.
Right.
Do you believe that self-fulfilling conflict, where you start contributing resources to conflict because others do,
Right.
do you think this kind of herding
Right.
self-fulfilling can occur, and does occur? Do you think it's important?
I was going to ask exactly the same question, because I can see the parallels
Right.
to modern financial markets, for example.
Right. So is there conflict herding?
Suppression of individual rationality as a group,
Right.
which is the ethnic group.
Okay, so that's an excellent question. Let me preface the answer to that by saying that there's stuff here that I've lots of stuff that's gone under the rug. But one important thing that's gone under the rug is that, just take over two-group society, okay, us and them, right? A polarized society, there would be roughly equal numbers on both sides, okay? Now, these societies are interesting in the sense that they're actually not that likely to enter into conflict because of the deterrence argument. But when they do, the conflict is very fierce, okay? So this polarization actually has a nuanced effect on conflict that has not entirely been captured here, okay? Now, keep that in your mind, and now I'll go on to answering your main question. So I'm going to refer to the PhD thesis of my student. We were talking about it at lunch today, right? Natalia Novta. So she's written a paper on the Bosnian War, and what she's done is she's looked at different municipalities in Bosnia, right, during the Civil War, and she's asking the question of how does conflict spread from one municipality to another, right? And what she does is she takes the same notion of polarization, and what she does is she shows that the municipalities which actually start are the quote-unquote safe municipalities, where one group is preponderant in terms of numbers. Very easy to win, okay? Once that happens, the adjacent municipality, which is now buoyed either militarily or even psychologically by the victory of the previous municipality, can now enter into conflict at a somewhat lower threshold of population. And the next one at an even lower threshold of population. So what Natalia shows is that the sequencing of conflict starts from low polarized municipalities and moves on to high polarized municipalities, where Serbs and Bosnians are equally numbered. Okay? So now this is not a comprehensive answer to your question, but it's one example of how contagion can be put into these models. We don't do it here, but it can be done.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as I said, there's refreshment next door, so, and I'm sure Debraj will